see the photo that I took.
All right, let's get this show on the road. What time is it? 11:13. Okay. Hopefully everybody else will come straggling in shortly. But very excited today. I mean, this, you guys may know, you may not know, you'll soon know. This is quite an extraordinary gathering of people. Ingeborg Rocker can't make it today, but we do have our images, so maybe we'll talk about our images as well. I've been wanting to do this for years. Let's put it this way. 5 years ago when I started teaching in this class is in the fall. This class is called the hand-drawn class. The class that was in the spring was called the computer class. 4 years ago they switched those. They called the computer class ADR1. They called this class ADR2. 3 years ago when Babak and I started coordinating this course, it was basically 90% digital, whereas 5 years ago it was probably 50% digital. So I actually think that this class in many ways is the last class to answer the first questions. The questions that these guys were asking when they were part of the first paperless studios after school. The change that happened in the 90s, which in many ways is now in mythology, the change that really not only took hold of Columbia and made Columbia what it is today, and for a lot of reasons why we're here, it has to do with changes that came in Columbia in the 90s, but it's also become a kind of mythology for architecture schools all around the world. Architecture schools all around the world started looking at Columbia in the 90s to see what they were doing as they integrated the computer into the design space. And so this is the first time, I don't know if you guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the first time there's really been a gathering to talk specifically about this moment in time, the paperless studio, the change that everybody has talked about for years and years and years now, the problems with having digital, what it is, what it gain, how do you understand the changes in terms of the technology of our mediation. These are the guys over there in our class. And so part of the reason why I wanted to gather them together is, let's say, to dispel some of this, to talk about really what happened, to talk about who was doing what were they doing, how did the students understand it, how did the students engage it. It's kind of an amazing thing to think in 1995, 1994 when it starts, there's no digital studios. By 2000, they're almost all digital studios. So within 5 years, this whole thing takes over in place. We're talking with Ingeborg a little bit. She was telling me about how at the time, if you wanted to be a player, you had to get your own SBM suite, and that was like $30 million. So if you really wanted to be in this game, you had to spend $30,000 to get yourself in the game. There's also some amazing things that have come up with this But it's incredibly important that we begin to think about this question, talk about it more specifically today as well. There's two things that happened this semester that I was involved with that kind of brought back to mind how important this time period was, how important this question was. One, involved with this symposium at Yale called Drawing Dead. They basically were asking the question as to did the computer kill drawing? And murmuring within everybody's background is actually Columbian. Did Columbia in the 90s kill drawing? Did these guys? That's pretty funny to think about, but that's kind of what was murmuring in behind questions, what was murmuring within people's thoughts. And another thing that happened this semester as well, the ACSA had a venture up in Boston, and it was specifically on the vision. And almost every presenter said something sort of, we need to get beyond the smooth surface grading and smooth surface curvature. I think we couldn't even see that for and it's kind of amazing that that's still one of the key questions that's part of what's in everybody's mind when they start to think about what it means to use a computer. So, these guys have also been incredibly brave today. They're going to show the equivalent of broadcasting your junior high photo. You know how comfortable you are putting up your junior high photo? We're going to show their student projects, some of their students. And I don't know about you guys, but I know that I would be great to show their projects, and I'm sure you're thinking now about your student projects and oh boy, 15 years down the line, I'm going to put from a student project to the lecture hall, but they can bring you to it. And this is really important as well, because you need to know visually what is what. You need a visual knowledge, visual information to understand part of the discussion and how to discuss it themselves over time. I'm not going to present the projects one by one. I'm going to introduce them, and while I introduce them, I'm going to show their images as a kind of background. Again, this is a kind of visual knowledge, but as we talk more and more, if they want to and when they want to, they can reference certain slides and start to point out specific problems, specific questions, specific techniques, specific aesthetic agendas, specific conceptual agendas, as they pertain to how they were working on it. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce them. I'm going to introduce them, and oh wait, I want to do something actually. This is part of what I'm going to do. Here's the two abstracts, 94, 95, 95, 96, and start to notice some interesting things. First of all, the entire thing is in black and white, except for the paperless studios. Paperless studios are the first colors that come into abstract, come in to describe this. I'm going to read you Bernard Shumi's description of these, just because it's kind of important to have that as a background. So, bear with me. Design studio is the core experience of architecture studies. In the fall of 1994, the GSAPP made history by instituting the paperless studio, a radical reversal of the standard notion of the student's home base as a manual drafting table in a walled cubicle. In the paperless studio, each of 33 students, I mean, he doesn't say this, but let's just say, you guys are like guinea pigs, right? Yeah? Receive his or her dedicated workstation, Silicon Graphics or Apple Computers Power Macintosh, in the advanced software and network capabilities required for any academic work, including research, writing, design, analysis, and presentation. To our knowledge, Columbia is the first architecture school to provide students with their own SGI machines and state-of-the-art visualization software, such as Softimage. The paperless studio is housed in the 7th floor mezzanine loft space of Avery Hall. This allows a separation between the air-conditioned central computer zone and the smaller adjacent exterior balconies. Right? That will serve as a communal workshop areas for traditional media. Studio faculty teaching the 6 sections, 3 in the fall, 3 in the spring, included Stan Allen, Keller Easterling, Greg Lynn, Scott Marble, Hani Rashid, and Bernard Schumi. So that's important. It's important to see how this was described in the abstract, see how it was presented. The only difference in the text between 94, 95 and 95, 96 is the phrase that says, "To our knowledge, we're the first to do it," is replaced with, "We are the first to do it." Pretty serious, huh? Substantial. Okay. Well, gotta make sure we get as close to it as we can. Is this coming on? All right, here we go. So I'm going to go chronologically, which means I'm starting with Ed. I don't know if it's too hard for you guys to see it. Maybe you can... Okay. Ed Keller. So I'm going to show the images, and while I'm showing the images, I'm going to read the bio. Ed Keller is a transdisciplinary designer, writer, and musician. He is the Associate Dean and Associate Professor at Parsons, the New School for Design. With Carla Leto, Ed co-founded AUM Studio in 2003, an architecture new media firm whose work has been exhibited and published internationally. Ed has been an avid rock climber for over 30 years and graduated from the GSAPP in 1994 as a 3-year MArch student. Now, that's Ed's bio. I'm going to say a couple other things. When I first met Ed, he was teaching at like 4 schools simultaneously, right? What were you teaching? You were teaching at Columbia, SCI-Arc, Pratt. Where else, Ed? You were teaching at 4 schools simultaneously. SCI-Arc, 5. Because I've always assumed, I've taken this, as soon as you cross over 3 schools, you become more of like a kind of nomadic mercenary. And I've always kind of thought this was an incredible, admirable thing about what you were doing, to be able to move through that many schools. to be able to move through that kind of extended discourse. And you were the director of the AAD program for one. For 1 year. All right. So each of these, we have PDFs for all of these, so we can come back into them. This is Ferda. So Ferda Colitan. Ferda Colitan is the founder of SU11 Architecture and Design, New York City. He was the recipient of the Honor Award for Excellence in Design in the Lucille Smizer Lonefish Memorial Prize from Columbia University. His firm received the Swiss National Culture Award for Art and Design and the ICFF Editors Award for Best New Designer in 2001. His work has been published widely, including Archilab's Future House, number of publications. Colitan participated in the Documenta 10 and Kassel in the Archilab conference in Orleans in 2001. The project Composite House has been featured in an exhibition, Strangely Familiar, the Walker Art Center in 2003. Colitan has taught design studios and theory seminars at the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, Pratt University, RPI, University of British Columbia, and the University at Aachen. In 2007, Colitan was named lead researcher for the Nonlinear Systems Organization. Both Ferda and Rhett have a similar story about how they got these images. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you had to take still photographs of your computer monitor? Screenshots, literally, right? Before the button. Okay, Rhett Russo. So, and Ferda graduated in 1995. No, 1995. Ed was 1994, Ferda 1995, Rhett 1995. Rhett Russo received his Master's of Architecture from Columbia University. He is an Associate Professor of Architecture at NJIT. Rhett's work is inspired by the transmissive capacities of matter and the ecologies of form that are part of the natural world. This approach parallels his interest in alternative modes of craft and its role in the development of complexity within the discipline of architecture. Rhett has received numerous awards, including the SOM Fellowship, the Van Allen Institute Dinklu Fellow, and the American Academy in Rome, the Young Architects Award of the Architecture League in New York. In 2009, he was awarded research residency at the European Ceramic Work Center. His work and writing have been published in Second Nature, Meander, a number of publications. He's a founder of Specific Objects. It was founded in 1997 in New York, an interdisciplinary, sustainably oriented design practice focused on delivering integrated design solutions that bring art, product design, and architectural services together. We believe that design is a form of expertise that emerges through the synthesis of practice, research, and collaboration. And this is your one image, Rhett, but this is from Keller Easterling's Paperless Studios. So this was the first Paperless studio in the second semester of, because the fall were the first Paperless studios, so this is the second semester. All right. Okay. David Rue is an architect, theorist, and co-director of Rue Klein, an experimental design office in New York. The work of Rue Klein has been widely published and exhibited and is recognized as one of the most respected speculative practices in architecture today. David's work and research examines contemporary design problems at the intersection of architecture, nature, and technology. David is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Architecture at the Pratt Institute, where he's also the director of the Network of Emerging Architectural Research. Ingeborg Rocker is not with us. We do have our images, but we'll go to who's here. Richard Garber is an associate professor at NJIT's College of Architecture and Design, teaches design studios and directs a unique design and manufacturing laboratory, the Fab Lab. His work uses computer simulation and computer numerically controlled hardware to generate innovative design, construction, and assembly solutions. He's also the principal of the New York City architectural firm Grow Architects. And Richard graduated in 1998. So we have from 94 to 98. Ed 94, Ferda and Rhett 95, David 96, and Rich 98. So we have the kind of transition here. This is part of the idea, to make sure that we see how it changed over a very tight time span, between 4 years, to see what begins to emerge from the work. The other thing that needs to be said too about our panelists is that not only were they, let's say, the early adapters, the first people that were in these paperless studios, the first people to begin using the software, but you have to think about, at the time, the professors were not skilled at this software. So it's really, in many ways, these guys that end up becoming the first skill set for digital technology. It's not like you sat down and Keller Easterling was telling you how to use Softimage. These guys really developed that skill set. The other thing, too, is they're all teaching. They've all transferred this now into pedagogy. They've all moved this into their own teaching, and we'll talk about how it's changed and how it's developed to today. They're also part of the crew that begins to do several of the first digital projects. David Rue works for Jesse Reiser and Nanako Umamoto, and if you know the Water Garden project for Jeff Kipnis, that's largely David's work, and that's quite an incredible and influential project amongst first digital things. I know that Richard was heavily involved with the church, was it Korean Presbyterian? Yeah, Korean Presbyterian Church of Greg Lynn, one of Greg Lynn's first employees, also working with Greg Pasquarelli in what ends up becoming SHOP. Rhett worked for Jesse and Nanako as well. Ferda and Ed, I mean, Ed's been bringing it now to every university that he's kind of come into. These guys are the kind of first generation that begins to kick this off. So this is a lovely thing to look at, so maybe we'll look at something else. So look at that. It's not bad, right? I like Evan. Evan's so serious too. Okay. Maybe we won't get that. Oh, I forgot I had these. Ed, I have these two little movies. Don't show those. Okay. Okay. Fair enough. All right. We'll leave that up. That's actually kind of nice. Okay, so let's start this out. And since I'm the only non-Columbia here, I'm going to start as a kind of outsider mythology. And if I was to state this, one of the things that people assume is that paperless Studios were a revolution started by Bernard Shinn, and that it was Ray Lynn who was the kind of master ringleader of this thing that happened in the 1990s, and that everybody at Columbia jumped into it like it was a one bat that they were ready to assume themselves. I think these are all false, but these are obvious. So, in a way, let's just start there. Who were the people that were driving this? Was it Bernard Shinn? Was it Ray Lynn? And who else can you bring into this conversation? And how did the students at Columbia receive it? After 19 of these particular studios, what was the general attitude? Was it excitement? Was it skepticism? Was it distrust? Was it split? Did it faction the school into two parties? Let's start with those two. Does someone want to jump in on that? Not.
Check, check, check. I can tell a pre-story. So a pre-story is in 91, 92, there was CAD software being used here and taught in the digital program, which I believe was run by Christos Tuntas. Does that name ring a bell to anyone? I think it was Christos Tuntas, and Eden Muir was involved with that, and another gentleman, Rory O'Neill, yeah. And the students were up in arms in a way against the software because it wasn't plugging into what they would be using in the outside world. So there were a number of proposals that were floated and student council meetings called with Bernard around the effectiveness of the training they were receiving that would they be able to take into both their creative practice and their professional practice. I wrote a proposal at the, literally at the incentive behind this was a discussion I had with Stephen Perella. Okay, so believe it or not, Stephen, who's now deceased, Stephen was one of the key factors in getting Bernard's ear for the proposal that I wrote in 1992, which was an ambitious proposal for X amount of money to be spent on SGIs and soft image. And I remember Bernard's response was, this is too much money, we can't spend this much money. But Eden and Rory picked up that initiative and they managed to get a machine donated. If I remember correctly, it was literally donated from Soft Image. So there was one Indigo XS24 maybe that was donated by Soft Image with Soft Image software. And that was a kind of a seed by which they plugged into a collaboration with, I think it was Art History to do renderings of Amiens Cathedral. And maybe that came out in 1994, I don't remember for sure, 95. So there was a trajectory between 92 and 95, which led to recognition, cross-disciplinary collaborations, funding. The funding, which again, my memory is a little hazy. I think there was a joint grant with both journalism and architecture that we shared with journalism to do technology infrastructure upgrades, which led to the purchase of the SGIs and the software that we had for the first paperless studios. So the student council was very involved in the 92-94 period in putting pressure. And actually it was a little bit politically ugly because the guy who's directing the CAD program resigned as part of that, which is how Eden took over. And Eden and Rory had actually been working on what would today be very trendy. They were working on scripting. They were working on parametric design in like 1991. But they didn't have an avenue to channel that work that they were doing into projects. So what they were doing was you know, it was very, very primitive. It was the kind of stuff that you would get in 1 week of learning how to use scripting now over the course of a year. But they were working on scripting back then, and the software that I'm almost certain they had developed in-house was oriented towards parametric design.
Now, how did you guys decide you had 10 questions? Well, but let's address this. So Ed Keller writes a proposal to begin this paperless studio missions. How many machines have been able to fix? I mean, you're not running a studio on one machine, so it had to be. You did?
Basically, it's kind of like how it looked like. I mean, that first paperless studio, each studio in the studio space had one machine. Had not one machine, had actually one machine that was running advanced software, which at that time was Soft Image. So it was one SGI in the studio and a couple of apples. You could do Form Z with. And then there was another machine you could sign up for in a computer lab. Right? So you had basically 3 paperless studios, in that newly sci-fi balcony space. You could only enter it with a card. It was locked and secure. And in there, 12 students had to share one SGI that could run Softimage, which was a software. We had no idea what it was. Greg had no idea what it was. Actually, Ed was TAing with Greg in the first paper list that I took with Greg. And Ed was the only one who knew a little bit what was going on. Everybody else was just pure experimentation at that point in time. But we had sign-up sheets, and literally we had to wait 12 hours to get 1 hour usage out of the SGI, and then wait 12 hours. So we wouldn't sleep or eat. It would all depend on when our time was up. So 12 hours, if it ends up 2 in the morning, that's when you have to be there. 4 in the morning, it wouldn't matter, because it was just a continuous clock around the semester to get your 1 hour of SGI and then take the photos of what you were actually doing.
How did you guys decide Softimage? What was the driving choice of
So there's another backstory here, which goes to a rendering firm that was run by a Japanese fellow named Isao Nagaoka, who I'm sure no one here knows, but Isao did contract work for Nikken Sekkei. I worked in Nikken Sekkei for a year before I came to Columbia. They had a New York office, and the chief designer there, Koichi Yasuda, had been a teacher with Bernard at Yale. He had been Bernard's student at Yale, and he had then been hired by Bernard and did something like 18 competitions with Bernard. He was one of the chief designers on the Kyoto Station competition with Bernard. And I was apprenticing basically at Nikken Sekkei. I got pulled into that competition in Charette for 10 days. I did nothing. I mean, I literally couldn't do anything really. So all I did was laboriously ink one drawing in a corner and watch while all the really crazy shit happened around me. But Isao got pulled in to do renderings. And those renderings were 36 40-hour renderings to generate one hidden line perspective. I mean, everyone here remembers what we used to wait for. David actually and I worked rendering projects together, and we would start a rendering to do like a 1280 pixel rendering and wait for 48 hours and pray that it came out well, and then doctor the hell out of it with Photoshop. Okay, but the story there was Isao did computer graphics work with Nikken Sekkei. He got pulled into Bernard's office, and in Bernard's office he was using Form Z to do renderings for Kyoto Station. Isao was an early adopter of those technologies, and when I was working in Isao's office with Sean Daly, who is still running Wind Tunnel Animation here in New York, we had a demonstration of Softimage one day. They came and they tried to sell us Softimage. And we were completely blown away, but it was extremely expensive. The SGIs were extremely expensive. So I remember at that time, Isao didn't pick up Softimage because it was too expensive for his operation. But in '92, I ended up being one of those people who bought an Indigo and Softimage. And it was extremely expensive. The setup was like $35,000 to get that. And so Softimage was one of the only things that you could use at that level. Actually, in parallel, Softimage was being used by Rory O'Neill in Germany. He had a rendering firm in Germany. I don't remember what the name of it was, but Rory was using Softimage also. And I think that was 92 or 93. So when Rory came back to participate in the CAD program at Columbia, somewhere around 93, he also had Softimage experience. So between my experience and Rory's experience, Form Z and Softimage ended up being part of the sort of recommended platform.
Maybe something I think could be also interesting to know is when we started with Softimage, what I remember the best, of course, is that first semester. We'll talk more specifically about the grouping in the second semester. But so it was basically Greg Lynn, Hani, and Scott Marble. And what I still remember is how different the individual takes were towards how to use Softimage. Almost comical, because nobody really had an idea. But everybody had already an existing ideology of what they wanted to do with the software. So I'm bringing this up because it's really important to understand there is this kind of experimental notion to, well, here's this new thing, it has just landed, what are we going to do with it? But then it's immediately put to service to support existing ideologies as well. And I remember that the work that was being produced in Scott's studio, for instance, was really about tectonics, about building, about materiality, kind of enhanced by the way how the computer would actually allow you to do these things. Hani was back then really interested in imagery and movies and cinema, and it had a lot to do with images that were being projected onto surfaces, colors, space through moving images, things like that. So he was doing that actually for a couple of years, after which he then started to do something else. And Greg was, of course, interested in form, but also back then he was very interested in technique as well. He really wanted us to look into using the software, which was not an architecture software, it's a movie animation software, so kind of like Maya, kind of precursor to that. And I remember I was coming from Germany, completely different sort of modernist way of thinking about architecture, and I was sitting in front of the computer, and Greg would just say, well, animate something. And I would think to myself, what the hell is he talking about? And he's like, and I would try to make things look like architecture, and he just like, stop that, just animate. And then we would like have little squishy meta balls that would bounce off of each other. I remember when I first did that and Greg came, he was like, yes, now you're getting someplace. So basically it was on that level. He had an idea what he wanted, but we had no idea what it would look like at all. Yeah, I mean, what I use personally is, and you saw that in that image, were skeletal attractors and sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, how different the approaches were. Because I think the reason why it was so successful here was a very wise move that Bernard made, was to not predetermine what the agenda for the computer would be, but to just let the most talented people in the faculty go at it. And I think he was very careful to pick a diverse range of people to go at it. And I think very quickly, it's amazing looking back on it, all of the issues that we're still dealing with were already there as seeds, in the early 90s, I think. Yeah. Even Stan, I think, this is a part of the story that is not so well known. It's the year after the Paperless Studio. Stan had his own initiative that was in my third year called, what was it, the Mixed Media Studio, or Combined Media Studio, yeah? And I was in that one, and I think he was pretty prescient for predicting the problematics of the computer in the discipline, not so much what you do with it, but its relative standing based on the general problem of media and architecture. And so, that too, I think, has also played out. So,
How is it received in the student body as a whole? And then you have to wait 12 hours to get a 1-hour slot. It's a pretty precious moment. Was there a high demand for this, or were you guys seeing it mad sun because it's kind of like a possible? What was its general reception?
So I think that when Stan brought this mixed media initiative, it was largely a way to try to deal with the time constraints that we all had as students using these machines. And I think what really became interesting in the later 90s when I was a student is people like David really started to figure out how to get geometry out of the software. And I remember him, this is like a really dumb story, but he came to me one day and he said, you have to export a PostScript file, right, from Wavefront. And it was like generational, it was kind of like all of a sudden we were able to get lines out. And as soon as you can get lines out, you could actually do things that you would do with really regular kind of architectural software. And so it began taking things that seemed, really kind of abstract and almost distant, and gave it a kind of immediacy, like we can now kind of take this stuff and be really different with architecture, you know? And so that was like really a super exciting.
Yes? No? Yeah. Another anecdote in terms of getting stuff out of the computer, it was really one of the big problems in the beginning. You could do all kinds of things that looked somewhat interesting, but there was no way of proving it or materializing it. So that was a big issue. And I remember a very beloved dear friend and colleague of ours, Jason Payne, who is now a professor at UCLA, who was in the same studio with us. And he early on started to develop beautiful drawings while we were all doing still this kind of stuff. And I would just kind of ask him, like, how is he doing it? How does he get this kind of complexity out of the computer? And of course he wouldn't tell. And one night at like 5 in the morning, I was sneaking up to him from behind, and I saw that he had actually put trace paper on top of the screen, and he was tracing the geometry by hand, ripping it off, and then drawing it and building these models. So literally he was generating it in the computer, and then because there was no other way of getting the geometry out, this is way before PostScript, before you figured out the trick. And so it was a very kind of elaborate manual way, but the results were amazing because they didn't look purely hand-drawn, of course. There was that kind of digital computational quality to it. Anyway, so we had to come up with all kinds of ways of being inventive to get just material and data out of the computer.
It was very exciting. Yeah, because when the first paperless studio was launched, I guess I was in my first year. And I came to Columbia for entirely different reasons. It had nothing to do with the computer. And I mean, I don't know if we could even go into what the reputation was pre-computer.
It should, because this matters. Columbia changed in the 90s. Absolutely. It became known for this digital work. Prior to that, what was it known for?
It was known for this strange thing that was happening called deconstruction. And it was exciting also for how everybody was complaining about it. And my kind of beginning, teachers would grumble, I don't know what the heck is going on in there, and it's not architecture anymore, I mean, stuff you hear today too. It's like this grumbling about how the discipline was being lost, and then you would look at the results, and it was incredible. It was like nothing you've ever seen before. And so there's no philosophical or cultural apparatus for knowing what the hell this is all about, but it definitely had an aura. And so in first year, we're still using the May line and learning how to draft and building basswood models. And meanwhile, there was this thing happening, and people in first year and second year were already buying like little Macs and using Form Z and Strata, you remember, to render, and just trying to almost build a hot rod in the garage to have the fantasy that one day you'll have a Ferrari, but there was a lot of kind of, I guess, grassroots thing happening below the paperless studio. It was rapidly affecting everything, so.
But I can also recall there being a lot of apprehension about who to take and what they were going to offer and how much it would really change what had been developing prior to the introduction of computers, which was a process which was largely, it was a generative process. I mean, in fact, Greg Lynn speaks about this in the index book quite clearly, that what happened was there was 2 or 3 years where students were sort of working under the methodology of still developing projects around 1 or 2 key drawings. So there was still a kind of generative overtone in terms of students becoming very facile with transforming drawing into projects. And what happened when the computer got introduced was that what had typically is a kind of gap between the process of making those drawings and bringing it to a project, that gap quickly got compressed. It got compressed in a way by the fact that the computer, in its kind of linear process of sort of do this, do that, demystified a lot of things that we didn't see about each other's work. I think Ferda gives this example of Jason tracing the screen. But those kinds of, and they were about collage, they were about neo-modernist compositional logics. There were a whole undertone of things that were happening that were very, very difficult, if not almost impossible to teach, between the drawing process and the process of making the project. And the computer basically kind of took that. There was a tension, I can recall for myself anyway, that the computer was basically going to take that away because it was this kind of tool which could codify those processes, make them really transparent, and make them repeatable. So there was on one hand the kind of feeling like, oh man, if I take that studio and I get really prescriptive about what I'm doing, am I really in control of the process? Am I really working through design? And that was in the air. It was seriously on the table. And I think that's one of the more concrete ramifications of the transformations of computing.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like people forget, like at places like MIT and Berkeley, they already had like big computer labs, and we had like a version of it with this guy that came before Eden, which was kind of like a proprietary CAD software, and like coming out of Negroponte, I think, wasn't it? It's like but anyway, like the real difference between how this was happening in the technical universities that had big budgets to spend on equipment versus us at Columbia, where we did it on like on fumes. Like there wasn't that much money actually compared to some of these other departments, and they completely separated the discipline from the technology. So you had the kind of nerds that would deal with the computer. It would be in a separate room on the lock and key, and there would be nothing about that technology that would be allowed to cross over into the studio, right? So there was this really interesting thing happen where it really crossed over into the discipline, and I think that's what shocked everybody, when they saw what was happening at Columbia, that it was no longer egghead stuff, but it was changing like the core of what we were doing.
And also to pick up on something that Ferda was saying before, the faculty that were engaging in this were really different. And when you see photos like the one from Architectural Record from 2000 or whatever that was, it just seems like outside this place they were all grouped together. But I think one of the reasons why it worked as well as it did is there wasn't a kind of competition, because these folks were all quite different from one another in terms of what they wanted to do. Where it got kind of interesting is when they sort of clashed with or engaged with some of the older faculty that were here. And I can remember once Jim Polshek, who was the dean here from 72 till 88, so before Bernard, was wandering around one day, and I had a review, and he came and he said, I really like the things that you're doing, but you made a building. And somehow, this computer stuff was sort of dismissed because it wasn't what real architects kind of did. And I remember this was a really striking kind of comment from a former dean, you know, it was good until you made the building. What were we supposed to do here in some ways, you know? So it definitely was embraced by some and not embraced by others.
I think the comment also that everybody's making, that there was a really diverse range of faculty who were investigating different themes that they were personally obsessed with is an important one, because that's something that Bernard was especially good in supporting. Not that Mark isn't, Mark is also, but Bernard really, I think when he came in, had to do some house cleaning and then also had to build a culture where really diverse viewpoints were all supporting each other somehow. And then what happened with the investigation there was also partly inflected. Before I actually go down this road, I remember going to many places, as probably you guys all also did, and having people say something about Columbia, which imputed a specific kind of monoculture here. And I remember having to say many times over the years, no, it actually isn't a monoculture. You see it from the outside as being something like the school, where everyone does quote the blob, but that is absolutely not the case. And I think that at the same time, there were a series of really, really intense trajectories that were being played out between what Peter and Cynthia and everyone at Any were doing, and Greg's connection to Any, and other folks' investigations of, quote, time-based and diagrammatic processes were. And there was definitely a hope that between the ability to render geometry susceptible to time in a way that it hadn't previously been able to be made available to time, and then to translate that newly sensitive geometry out in various ways, that was potentially a really, really interesting moment. And I remember in '95, Greg was, I have a feeling that Greg was kind of on the fence about the effectivity of that taking place. It was almost a kind of a form-function relationship question. And there was also a question of the degree to which a diagram, when rendered sensitive to time, would actually capture something truly essential about whatever the system was that it was perceiving. This was kind of hand in hand with the freezing the diagram question.
Well, it's a really interesting issue because that it was more about a set of ideas than about the technology. That strain of the blob was really not really about the blob ultimately, but about the production of the unfamiliar and the new. And like I remember Keller gravitated towards the history of cybernetics. So she was interested in the fact that we were using a machine consisting of switches and correlating it with large infrastructures, also read as a configuration of switches, and to some degree she has still worked on that. And then you had Scarp Marble, who I think was very much focused on practice, like tool of practice. So something that I think has played out in terms of BIM and parametric tools and so on, collaboration. But Greg, I think, represented the most, I think, shocking one. And I think it's very logical, I mean, why it got so much press, because there was really nothing quite like it where the technology or the possibility of it was being correlated with something like Bergson and the concept of the Duret and the Luz and the diagram, and then all of it became a kind of discourse of producing, I guess, the strange. And I think that's always been something that's kind of in the background of Greg's work to this day, that even though there were moments where there was a kind of methodology of incorporating external forces so on, it was never really a kind of science of form making in the same sense that, say, certain European practices latched onto, like NBRDV, for example. And instead, it was always a kind of imaginary force or a kind of theoretical force to produce novelty and the emergent and so on. So these were very different strains, and none of which that constituted the movement, you know. So the digital always was a kind of weird false rubric that really didn't exist as such. It actually consisted in many things.
I agree, David. And I would even go so far as to say that even within the individual ideologies, they were also trying out different ideas. I think in Greg's case in particular, for instance, there were different kinds of arguments which he would couch the work in. It was not, in my opinion, one that was consistently going through. For instance, there was that whole idea of the non-Euclidean space, which he was really interested in. The idea of UV topology, the idea, Darcy Thompson, which he was really interested in, ecology, Bateson. There was that. Then obviously there was the whole kind of Peter Eisenman process, time, autonomy condition that was part of the interest. And they met here and there, but not really in a clear fashion necessarily. A lot of it was being developed as he was going on, through the work and what we were doing. And I think, to me, that was one of the most exciting things. And it took me some time to realize that, because I can honestly tell you that I suffered through that studio. It wasn't all fun. It really wasn't, because we didn't know what to do. We really didn't have access to the stuff to make our ideas come out. The final review, that was really interesting, because we felt completely inadequate. We were seeing all the non-paperless studios, beautiful drawings being pinned up, fantastic models, and then here we are with that weird apparatus you're pointing out. And we felt really inadequate. I mean, I remember I was miserable. Oliver Lang, I was talking to him, we were like, damn, what's this going to be? And then in the final reviews, we had Sylvia Levin, Jeff Kipnis, Bernard Chumi, Jesse was there, all like a huge lineup for the day. And they started to talk really intelligently about what we were doing. And at that point, we're like, hold on, maybe this is actually interesting. And it took me really probably another year or two until I really understood what we were doing and why it was important, or what was interesting about it. It didn't come during the process itself. It definitely needed another year or two to settle and see more of the stuff, and then I was immediately TAing and I was just getting it. But it was certainly a process. But the excitement was of course being part of that, looking for something without really knowing exactly what it is.
Yeah, I think I used to see Ferda chain smoking in the lobby upstairs, because they had to come out of that studio to relax because they couldn't smoke up there. So they'd come in the lobby and I'd see, how are you doing, Ferda? Oh, it's going good. And it was really incredibly stressful. But I think yeah. That was also different. Yeah, I think there was a kind of incredible transformation that I haven't experienced much in my life, and it was this process in which the kind of architectural design initiatives that were going on were really starting to dictate their own theory. In other words, there was a clear transition from places where there was no theory and no way to kind of approach certain problems, especially when you're working with a software that's not architectural. It's not designed to be architectural, so it in itself kind of undermines your intentions, especially when you're trained for several years to work in a certain way. But it really, I think, as what Ferda just described, it really started to generate a different sensibility over the years that was uniquely its own thing. It had no real precedent in the context of the school and in terms of the way people were working.
Yeah, and I think we've been talking quite a lot about the design faculty, but there were other people around here like Sanford Quinter and like Manuel Delanda who really started they created a kind of theoretical agenda about this stuff. And certainly Quinter's work with the virtual and the vital and that kind of thing, he was very clever in the way that he could couch these kind of emerging design practices into a kind of body of work. And that I think also kind of legitimized it beyond these walls a bit.
I remember that an essay that Sanford wrote in probably 89 or 90, Landscapes of Change, which was in assemblage, was really definitive for a bunch of us because Sanford was drawing a correspondence between specific morphologies that you could pull out of someone like Henry Faucion's Life of Forms in Art in Boccioni and Renee Tom's work in catastrophe theory. So trying to identify this set of potential points of question about where a morphology has a protocol and a life of its own, and where that morphology exists within a sequence that's a trajectory that's capturable within art, and a trajectory that's captured in the natural world, and a trajectory that's captured in mathematics. So the kind of promise and the question in that essay was profound because it was arguing that there would be a kind of a point of overlap between the intensities of human life, the crises of war that Boccioni was identifying, the formal vocabulary used to identify it, the similarity between that formal vocabulary and things that Renee Tom was fascinated with in catastrophe theory.
But Ed, there was no. I mean, what you're suggesting, I guess, is that there wasn't an autonomous problem. There was actually a whole lineage of connectivity inherent to the kinds of tools and things that we were working with. I mean, I think there's always that misconception that there's that on some level, once you started to work digitally, it was an autonomous thing, but there was an incredibly deep history in terms of generative technique and in drawing and things that were already in place, that were implicit in the problems that everybody was dealing with. I mean, wouldn't you, isn't that what Sanford is? Yeah.
I think Sanford was pretty interesting for kind of revitalizing discourse about modernity. In the late 20th century, he was a really, I think, key figure in architecture for really trying to essentially do a revisionist history of modernity, to assimilate a lot of other things that were never discussed in modernism as understood in architecture as compositional system and so on and so forth. So one of the odd things that happened, I think, was the computer understood as an instrument that can measure and then calculate as a kind of general, I think, misunderstanding of what the computer really is, I think, in my opinion. But this kind of box, this refrigerator that can bring in inputs from the world that can be measured and positive and then calculate a solution, became a kind of model of putting forward a definition of an architecture of contingency. That is, the architectural object is a kind of artifact of these other contexts, be it economic or cultural, and sometimes bad caricatures, like a particle in the particle system is a pedestrian and it's kind of swirling around in a dynamic force system and traces contours that defines a new unfamiliar architectural object, which you have to accept because it's kind of methodological and a direct result of these unseen forces that have always been around us, that we knew were around us, but we've never been able to deal with because we didn't have the computer. Right? So I think this, for me, was a real problem. I really hated the work that came out of that way of thinking. And I think it's become very difficult to talk about the object of architecture, the thing that is the building or the architecture or whatever you want to call it, outside of context, outside of these forces, or as a thing that might actually change the context, I think has become a very difficult thing to talk about relative to the computer.
I think, David, even though I completely agree with what you say from like looking backward today, I think one also has to acknowledge that while it was happening, it was necessary to break away from the idea of the object in order to, I guess, rebuild it in different ways. Because I do remember that the word object was not something you're supposed to use during those first couple of years. It was detrimental to the idea of what computation could actually provide. So we were using forces and maybe landscapes, flows and fields, and anything that could not be objectified, because one of the early premises was that the computer can actually engage materiality outside of the logic of an object. And I think it was important, even if misguided, looking back. I think it was important in order to sort of push the way how we were working through digital devices and understanding what architecture is. And I think another very important point, to me at least, is how quickly sort of quote-unquote the digital project that was fed in terms of different ideologies, but then even within those, it started to sort of branch out and bifurcate very rapidly, right? It became a biological, genetic project. It became a universalist physics project, think Carl Chu, you know, even in terms of metaphysics, of course. It became sort of a kind of very straightforward bureaucratic process project. So there were all kinds of different branches, and they still do exist today, right? They have, in and of themselves, evolved into certain territories, but I think we all know they're alive, right? So at this point, it's really very difficult to capture all that within one notion, of course.
I think when this happened, it was really important because we're coming right out of POMO and deconstruction, and there was a lot of concern about like composition, like the dark side of composition, like reinforcing structures of power that really should be contested. And so I think it was a very valuable kind of opportunity to contest that, to contest the architectural object in that sense. But in recent years, what I've become very concerned about is the idea that the computer has only begun to be the instrumentalization of these contextual forces. And so what we're starting to see with BIM, or parametric, the idea of the parametric software, it's not the kind of convenient school that cool designers can use to make life a little easier, but rather the other side of it, where the entire software industry in collaboration with the building industry is beginning to rationalize the production of architecture on an unprecedented scale. So we've seen this happen in other fields and other material practices, where expert systems essentially replace the operator, but there's nothing really, I would be really depressed to think that architecture could be codified as a set of rational procedures, which could be embodied in software, and then, yeah, get rid of the architect at that point, right? Like a call center AI stuff. But so, yeah, and it seems like, no, that couldn't possibly happen, but recently I read this thing about how this massive grant was issued to produce the kind of mother of all BIM softwares, to essentially rationalize a lot of this production. And so I think it's something that we, although it made sense within the discourse and the discipline to contest composition at one point, I think there's a very different kind of problem that's emerging now, which might lead us to question the field, to the notion.
Yeah, I mean, this ties back to, in a kind of a simple way and then more complex, to the question of what it means when you build the diagram. Because this I'm going to take up the point that David was just raising. You know, you see someone do a very intensive and beautiful analysis of a set of systems on a site, and they think that they're tracking the essential characteristics of the system on the site, whether it's the movement of pedestrians or change in program or emotional, quality of a crowd. And then the question becomes, how do you translate whatever the, quote, essential information you've achieved through your analysis into a proposal for a project? And we've all seen people get completely seduced by the form of the analysis and simply build the form of the analysis. And I don't have a problem with that if the designer is saying, I'm using this as a form finding, and I'm going to post-program. And I know that novelty, for example, can be generated through post-programming just as easily as it can be generated in other ways. But oftentimes what you see is you see someone doing that kind of analysis, or using a generative process, like forget the analysis, simply using a generative process and saying, I've identified the essential behavior of the system. And magically, that generative process or the analysis is going to carry that essential property of the system forward into the proposal as a design. And that kind of thinking to me is extremely weak. But what it also speaks to is having a model of how a system behaves. And the kind of critical question around BIM systems that you're bringing up right now is, to my mind, that they're all built on a model of optimization. And that model of optimization is extremely opinionated and unaware of its own position and its own opinion, the fact that it is an opinion. It's very clear that it thinks that certain modes of efficiency and engineering efficiency into a building system are the ways to go. And so for me, the architectural project, and this is why I really admire, for example, Carl's work, is to generate a kind of autonomous mode of thinking, whatever the process, the generative process is, or the model that's in play, so that one does become aware that there's a model in play that's provisional. And this is where the contingency term that David was just using comes back for me. I mean, if one is aware that any model is contingent on a whole set of other relations, that doesn't devalue the model per se, but it gives you a lot more ammunition, a lot more leverage in terms of how you might use a model to think design and then to practice design. It seems to me that maybe that was one of the things that was at stake for a lot of people in the 90s, was they were thinking, well, maybe there's a technique here that will somehow streamline the ability to create a feedback loop so that as people are thinking design, design will be rendered more vulnerable in a good way to a kind of a critical reevaluation. But that's almost like Walter Benjamin's naive hope for cinema. In a way, you realize that maybe this gets back to the point you were making about reinvestment or repositioning modernity. You realize that no matter what the techniques are, they kind of get reabsorbed and co-opted. But to me, that seemed to be one of the hopes. For me, that always was one of the hopes. Because no matter what I was teaching, I always loved the studios that, for example, Carl would run, because it was so clear what every student would do was the same, and what you were looking for is micro variables within the outcome of the studio as an investigation, which I never could do in my own studios, because I was not nearly so interested in technique as a kind of a control, but more pushing this general discussion around the boundaries of how you can become critically positioned in relationship to your own thought. But nonetheless, I thought that was Carl's project in a way, and I've always loved the studios because of the way that they yield that.
You guys are kind of naturally flowing in the way that I wanted it to flow, because I wanted it to come to today. So the problems of today, or the questions of today, both how I understand the digital in architectural design, and it's almost background, that it's less constant in terms of a productive existence, and it almost becomes such that it turns into something like this. If you think about that, argument. And from that, one of the things that I've always found interesting about this discussion at Columbia, and multiple discussions actually, was that they were all trying to figure out not only what the hell was going on in terms of the novelty of form, but this course of design that had been known not only in terms of the basis of agricultural practice, but in terms of architecture. What it's not just breakage, but it's the time between things that computer starts to extend. I think you know one of the where do we see that? Where do we see that? Or how do you guys see the legacy of that conversation within your own pedagogy or within what you see as the architecture community at large? To try to bring that, conversation to maybe not specifically, bring it specifically to Columbia, but any of us. I mean, what do you think? How's the legacy of this?
It's probably a bad sample group because we're probably too consistent in our politics of this, actually. But probably a spectrum, but basically we're all kind of on one side. But I think what I observe is I went to Columbia that was very explicit about contesting existing logics. And now we don't see that strategy so much. Okay? There are very few schools in the world that are very explicit about challenging existing logics. Now what we see more of is outright acceptance and training for existing logics, or a kind of theory of you gotta sneak in there and disrupt it from the inside somehow, right? So, like dissolve the architectural intelligence into a wider field of intelligence and practices, right? And I'm kind of still in the old Columbia mentality of I'm content to be in the minority, and because generally I think I got into architecture because I don't like the way the world is. And so it's kind of unimaginable to me to just dissolve my interest into a greater practice. It's just not who I am. I'm not saying it's right for everybody, but that's just who I am. But I think it is becoming more and more difficult, I think, to contest the existing models that are in operation today. So, and I'm less optimistic that somehow we can kind of work from within. I think we might be totally underestimating the forms of intelligence that are already operating. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to open it up to questions. I'm sure that some of you guys have something you'd like to ask of the generation between.
Please don't ask what software you use. First, like 5 years lecturing about always the first question is what software.
Well, maybe I should just flesh out who Stephen was. Stephen was here at Columbia for a number of years running publications, and he was a contentious architectural theorist. When I was a student, did a number of competitions with him. I'm pretty sure that Stephen was the one who introduced me to Greg, and he was working really closely and intensely with Bernard, obviously, because of his role in publications. So he saw some of the work that I was doing in '92, I guess, which is how I got folded into that conversation. But that's just the kind of the record on who Stephen was and his involvement with the culture, which was very, very intense for a number of years. And yeah, sometimes combative, but very, very intense. So I think he deserves a lot of credit, which people might not be giving him. And I had my fights with him too, for sure. But he was a very interesting guy. But the conversation issue that you bring up is an interesting one. I'm not sure what you mean. Do you mean did we capture conversations? Do we still capture them?
Yeah, I think, and someone definitely talked about that a little bit before, but, you know, final reviews were, and I mean, they still are, obviously, to an extent, but were really these kinds of big deals because you would get these folks that were really forging new territories in fairly different directions, really talking about an agenda, you know, with student work, you know, and so in that sense, I feel like the kind of connection that we had as being people that were really producing some of this kind of provocative stuff that was then being kind of digested and spoken about to a very high level. We were saying how you know, Jesse would come in and really talk about the work intelligently and it made you feel better and this kind of thing was you it was a very kind of critical moment. And I think one thing that I was going to say before that, may or may not be appropriate here is, in terms of the kind of generations of architects, there ended up being, because of these technologies and the way they were utilized, they really took a group of people that were relatively young and relatively unknown and kind of put them on the world stage. And so there was this kind of almost hiccup that happened where people that were in their, mid-40s or something like that, where it was kind of their turn, they were just passed over because of this new stuff. And so there really is a kind of change, a politics, a change in the kind of politics of how this played out as well that I think is kind of overlooked.
One thing that seems clear, and what made Columbia so special and still, I think, is see that the discourse is a lot more important than the equipment. And the equipment comes and goes, the technique comes and goes, but the discourse is ongoing and actually can be traced pretty far back to.
Maybe one way to also follow up on the question Michael raised about where we are right now does connect back to issues of power and how whatever the tools are that we're using make us more complicit with systems of control. And I think that maybe that's one of the things that's at stake, or at least it's certainly one of the things that I've spent the past 3 or 4 years thinking about more. The last design studio I taught here a couple of years ago in 2010 was focused specifically on systems of control and encryption on an infrastructural level, a material level, a new materials level, and a global energy level. So, for me, those are the places where some of the most urgent questions need to be asked around how design plugs into that and what tools or systems are already complicit with us. With it, Foursquare seems trivial, or it did maybe a year and a half ago, but it's got one of the biggest venue databases in the world. It renders us all visible to each other in a way that is historically unprecedented, and it's eagerly encouraging people to build apps on top of its API. It's very much about spatiality and being rendered an actor on a world stage in a way that wasn't possible until only a couple of years ago. And that's part of the kind of question of control, and that does directly connect in the next decade, if not sooner, back to BIM. Because people are working with Patch Bay and BIM systems simultaneously. Now, Patch Bay would be something that you would think, the public laboratory works with, or civic scientist projects work with. But no, Patch Bay is being used to run BIM projects by an architect named Kimon Onuma, who's practicing within a kind of a geo-design territory and a parametric design territory. Although most of the people here who would see his parametric design thinking would cringe, nonetheless, this person is someone who's doing work for example, the government and the military, who's working at a very high level with BIM, who's building software in his office to create bespoke connections between BIM systems and using Patch Bay to do it. That's a really, really compelling design space. It's also a terrifying one because then you can rewind to Godard's film Alphaville or any other, grim vision of the future that you want. And you can see that if designers aren't thinking in that space really, really intelligently, then once again, we as designers, we as architects will lose the game. But it's much bigger stakes today than I think it was, 15 or 20 years ago. Although for Godard, it was the world was at stake.
It's really interesting. I think that's really right on, and also what David was pointing out before. I mean, there's something about computation or generative digital techniques that is quite different in the sense that it was originally used to sort of break open a way of thinking, certain ideologies, right? Kind of to, kind of go against the establishment of thought, of ideas in a certain way. And now, 15 years, 20 years later, we realize how much it turned into new kind of establishment, right? Through things like BIM, etc. Some using the ethics of efficiency, sustainability, etc. Others, the ones you're pointing out, even go into more dangerous terrain, if you will. And I think that's what's so different than, let's say, what the tool was before that we were using, which was, rulers and pens, right? They did not have that kind of a power. It was very specific to the architect's discipline. But the moment we engaged within the sort of other thing, which then grew into the internet, nobody talked about that, right? I mean, when we were here in 94, 95, the internet started to do its like infant steps. It was just working between universities. Remember those times? I remember getting the first kind of account. We didn't know who to send an email to because nobody else had it. So we would just send it within our classmates in studio. And, oh, yeah. But what I'm trying to get at is that basically, I think what is interesting to me is picking up on the question, how can we keep maintaining our position in terms of questioning and challenging the status quo within the contemporary tools we have, without continuously providing matter or food, so to speak, that later on turns into the things that we set out to fight in the first place. Right? I mean, it seems to be one of those ironies, I guess, of how we work.
Before there was this talk about, then wondering about the change in tools, that before you were talking about making drawings in the project. And what we really, kind of incident that Bertie talked about, if the role of the representational output of this music as a means of playing with discourse for the architect, and how that changed with this setting output. So, I would like to, I don't know, in the sense, the importance of the family, for that discourse, that this couldn't be the beginning place for this set of, questions being asked. What is the role? And we talk a lot of the impossibility, the snapshot, the hardship of it. We hear in school so many people thinking about printing, thinking about render time, all these other things. What is that in the sense from the computer, from that box that we're talking about before? How? What do you guys think is the role of representation? What is the role of the output from the box?
Question about what has been the effect of the technology on the way we represent and
Well, what is the effect of the technology in how we see what we get outside from the box? Because before we were directly in a way working with the output, now the output is something that is a secondary step in the process.
my response to that is to just advise trying to think about what's happening in relationship to computation in non-metaphorical ways, to learn as much as you can about exactly what's happening on a material level, like it's a patterning device for electricity and how that translates to computation is incredible mystery. It's kind of astonishing, actually. But these metaphors of input, output, computer being a box, a black box, right? All these things, they're primarily metaphorical to help us understand something that we really have trouble understanding, right? And because of the metaphors being such, it results in problems that I would say aren't really valid problems. Like we freak out about the bias of certain software in making us produce representations of a certain style, and people claim that it's disturbing that it's not coming from us but from the machine. I think that's totally false problem, because I don't think there is any tool that is completely free of that. Like even a pencil, people say somehow that's free of these biases, but that too is a kind of embodiment of a Euclidean knowledge of draw a line. What's a line? And all right, so do you know how we get graphite? It's kind of a complex process, and to mill the wood, to have the graphite. I mean, it's kind of a crazy thing in and of itself, but the embodied knowledge is very small compared to, say, Revit, right? Where it's a software that makes certain kinds of ideas about architecture very easy and others very difficult. So it's got a lot more embodied knowledge, and then there's other stuff yet to come, you know, way beyond Revit. And there's going to be more and more knowledge embedded in the technology, and that, I think, is something that concerns me. Like, at a certain point, when there's too much knowledge embedded in the tool, you know, there may be a bit of a tipping point here, where our own autonomy is becoming vague. And so I've always been very interested in Ed's discourse, right? Because there was, I think, always been, even when you were a student here, a new ethics that you were trying to articulate and have articulated over the past 10 years about a kind of a complicity that we have with the technological flows. We're just part of it, right? And somehow another form of autonomy kind of emerges that's not entirely human, you know? And then that's the thing we should be thinking about. What are the ethics of that non-human relationship we have to things like
We're kind of running low on time. There's an event, an open house event that's happening here at 1. So, are there some further questions?
Maybe from my point of view, one of the most interesting things that's happening right now is the kind of potential erosion and collapse of the university model in general. And partly that's driven by economics, because universities are incredibly expensive. And even in countries where education is cheap or free, that model is experiencing great attrition. And there are plenty of movements to try to stave that off, whether it's by rejiggering the kind of business model of universities, or if you see the Western Governors University Coalition in the United States, states getting together to form online universities, or if you look at Mozilla's Open Badges project, which is a way of developing credentialing and micro-credentialing around non-formal learning environments. Those are all factors which come to bear on what I think is actually a pretty unprecedented erosion and collapse of the university as a model. And if you go back to what Mark C. Taylor was writing a few years ago, I think people will remember his op-ed in the New York Times, titled "End the University as We Know It." He was essentially making an argument for building education around cross-disciplinary collaboration focused on design challenges. So if the design challenge is water cleanliness in Bangladesh, then you build a team around how you solve that problem. Team of economists, team of architects, teams of engineers, teams of software developers. And look, it's very easy to build those teams. It's much more difficult to take a behemoth like a university as a cultural and economic practice and turn it around so that it just says, yes, we have to change the way we deliver accreditation overnight so that we can support in the professional world and in the reputation economy world the way that when you put a team like that together, the university confers accreditation upon them so that they get whatever they're supposed to get from their experience in the university, which they've paid for. Again, because I've been working a lot in the past 6 months on and with the Mozilla Open Badges team, I see that as one potential way out because it's essentially trying to build an ecosystem using metadata around quote badges that allows people to vet within a matter of seconds or minutes whether someone's done the work they say they've done, who they've collaborated with, what their social graph is around that work, what the reputation economy is around the work, what the critic's reputation economy and social graph is around the work. So if you're not an expertise in hydrology, you can vet someone's quote claims within a matter of minutes. And to me, when that gets accepted within a broader marketplace, it will do two things. One, it will totally put the coup de grace in the university model, because if people can gain informal education and micro-credential that outside the university, very few universities can survive. But two, it could potentially, if it's incorporated within the kind of collaborative framework that you're talking about, it could sustain the university model, or at least the best parts of the university. And I personally hope it can drive the cost down to approaching zero, even for educations like a Columbia or a New School education, which are supposedly the elite of the elite. So that's my very narrow focused way of answering partially the problem that you raise, because that's the only thing I'm focusing on for the past 6 months. And I think there are a lot of other ways of answering that. But I think you raise an extremely important question, because the institution is not fully capable of responding to that form of collaboration. But again, it's emerging for sharing information, whether it's from design studio to design studios. It's one of the ways that people learned 5 years ago, 7 years ago. So I think that there's a ground up effect that's taking place as well, just supporting that kind of collaboration.
Well, I think there's definitely going to be far fewer institutions of higher learning, or at least it's not going to exist in its current form. But yet, the elite universities will remain. I think because people will just give money for the sake of this kind of mythology of protecting the knowledge, right? That's embodied there. I don't know if it's mythological. I mean, there's a lot to be said for that, I think. But I think maybe a question more appropriate might be, is there still a discipline left in architecture that constitutes a body of knowledge that can be protected within the university? Or is it really nothing but a problem of predicting progressively more decentralized and complex forms of participation in the world as architects, if you could call it that, right? And a problem of training people for that participation, gauged on economic viability, right? And who knows what that's going to look like a bunch of people on Facebook doing a project together? I mean, it's, I'd rather quit at that point, I think. But,
Yeah, I completely agree, and I would even say straight up, really, you have to resist the problem that you were kind of talking about in your question, because I think, and that, I'm just sort of echoing a lot of the things that have been said already, but that model clearly, if you think it through, goes towards sort of understanding the world as problems that have a kind of clear solution to them, and it's about figuring out that solution in the most cost-efficient, people-efficient way, and then solving it. And you can call that, sustainability, and you can call it optimizing programmatic conditions. You can, if you talk about optimization and efficiency, that's really what it is. If you want to be rigorous about that ideology, it leads towards one optimal condition. Now ask yourself, as a designer, is a singular optimal condition something you find interesting and desirable or not? And all of you have to answer that question, because architecture still gives you opportunities to position yourselves within that particular dilemma, right? But I think, the ones on this side of the table, and I'm sure a lot of you would probably feel uncomfortable about such an equation. And it becomes more of an engineering question, in the sense that, you've got to find that solution. And architecture really is a cultural profession, right? And I don't know when that has changed, and I hope it hasn't. And if it hasn't changed, it means there is something intangible in the way how we work. You can call it aesthetics, but I think there's much more to it as well, that cannot be understood through the lens of efficiency at all. Right? And I think that, to me, is what I find interesting, and why I chose to be an architect. And I'm, not willing to give that up without a fight.
If you could take every external factor, let's just as a thought experiment say you could, would it add up to the architectural object? Or would there still be something missing after you compiled in everything external, And I think that's kind of a dumb way of restating the problem, and I would like to say, yeah, there's still something missing, and that might be why there still is an architectural discipline, that the kind of dark nucleus of the architectural object is kind of hard to put our finger on, and, or I hope so, We'll see it.
We have time for one more question. Is there one out there? Please.
The last comment
Go ahead and name names.
All right, we'll leave. I'd like to thank our panelists. The quote that I carried with me from the same artwork essay is the one about how every advanced art form strains laboriously for effects that are later achieved effortlessly by a change in technology. And what I think is so important for us to continue to question as our technologies change, and as certain things become obvious, is to see the moment when it is the moment. And what are the cultural questions, aesthetic questions, architectural questions that are still incremental? And you guys have the fortunate position to be in one really intense moment in our recent history. But what I also want to make sure everybody knows is it's still going on, right? It's going on right